morning to all of you. My name is Margaret Barr. I am president of the Battle of Fort San Carlos Commemoration Committee, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker. Stephen L. Kling Jr. is a practicing attorney and president and managing partner of Jenkins & Kling, PC, in St. Louis, Missouri. He obtained a Master in Finance and a law degree from St. Louis University. Steve has been recognized in the peer-reviewed Best Lawyers in America for over a decade. He is the author of many legal articles, including an authoritative set of 3 articles published in the Journal of the Missouri Bar on the history and purpose of the zoning and planning laws in Missouri. Steve has been a longtime student of 18th century history, particularly military history. In 2015, he published the Great Northern War Compendium, which involved 43 authors and national experts from 11 different countries. Steve wrote 12 of the 73 chapters in that 2-volume book, covering the armies, battles, campaigns, and events of that war, which raged across Northern Europe from 1700 to 1721. And he also served as the editor. More recently, he has co-authored a book with Christine L. Swordstrom from Seville, Spain, and Marisa T. Lopez from Tampa, Florida, entitled The Battle of St. Louis, the Attack on Cahokia, and the American Revolution in the West, using his decades of research. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Stephen Kling.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come to St. Genevieve. I haven't been back for a couple of years, but there's always all sorts of exciting things going on here. So, although it was very hot yesterday, I got to revisit some of the sites. And congratulations to you all. It's just a wonderful town. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, although obviously I'm an author of the book, I had a tremendous amount of help, and I'm not going to sit up here and give you a litany of people and museums and libraries that helped me, but I'm going to mention a couple. Obviously, I had 2 co-authors, Marisa T. Lopez, had a background in museum studies, and we had to interface with almost 40 different museums and libraries. And she was very helpful, and I learned from my prior book not to try to extend myself too much, so that was great. But Christine Shostrom from Seville, Spain, was just a wonderful co-author. She wrote the biographical chapter on Fernando de Leyva. It includes a full listing of their possessions, he and his wife, when they died. She's probably the national expert in Spain on him. And not only did she write that chapter, but her influence permeates the book. That's probably not obvious when you read it, but her knowledge of Spanish and French, particularly my French is very weak, my Spanish was fairly good, but she was just wonderful in terms of helping Margaret Carr, Leslie Richards, a number of other people, the España chapter, the DAR, they were all very, very supportive. So my particular interest in this actually spans in part from, I had an ancestor who was in the militia at the time of the battle, Joseph Rubidoux, and he shows up in the Spanish militia list before and after the battle, so pretty much ensuring he was there. And like a lot of French, he came to Montreal in 1770 with his father, moved to St. Louis, and settled there and went on to have a number of children, and one of them ended up founding St. Joe, which was always the big claim to fame for the family until we dug a little bit deeper. Much of the legwork was done by Clyde Rubidoux. I have his 1,100-page book of all the descendants of Andre Rubidoux, which is a godsend in terms of trying to figure out the genealogy. Next slide. So for the longest time, this history was in great dispute. I hope many of you have probably heard of J. Thomas Sharpe. He was an historian from 1883. I know some of you are in the back, so you probably can't read it, but I'll try to read some of this for you. He quoted in his book, his History of St. Louis City and County, that it seems reasonable to conclude that the popular account of the attacks of 1780 is mainly an issue of ingenious fictions fabricated by creative imaginations during 50 years of oral traditions. Full of inconsistencies and unsustained by authority, it is not entitled to its place in authentic history. Well, in his defense, the three main sources of this history were not available to him. That would be the Haldeman papers, the Spanish archives, and the George Rogers Clark papers. So that he's given a little bit of a pass. In 1932, on Valentine's, go back, I'll finish that one, thanks. 1932, on Valentine's Day, the full-page article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch claiming that Stella Drum, who was the librarian of the Missouri Historical Society, had found conclusive evidence that this history had happened. I actually read her article. It's mostly based on the George Rogers Clark papers, not so much on the Spanish archives or the Haldeman papers. But there was enough there that she could conclude that the battle actually happened, both at St. Louis and Cahokia. Though I find it interesting as a political matter, despite the fact that she was with the Missouri Historical Society, her findings were published in the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, which probably, my guess, meant that there was still some friction over whether this history happened. Next slide. Not going to spend a lot of time with this in terms of the history. I know you know it in terms of what happened after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War there. The possessions in North America changed hands. Property that was French west of the Mississippi became Spanish. But what is important to know to understand the battles and the history is what happened with Spain. Spain was France's ally. They suffered horribly in the war too. They had some of their main bastions, Manila and Havana, that were actually captured by the British. And Carlos III knew that something had to change, so he had a complete reorganization of defense of the colonies. No longer would Spanish regulars from Spain be sent, but there would be a new system of defense that would be centered on militia. And militia was to be uniformed and equipped at state expense. It was also to be trained primarily by, I'll get to this in a minute, by corporals and sergeants of the new regulars. And it was all men that were aged 15 to 50 were required to be in the militia. Now, to augment the militia, there was to be new regulars that were going to be established in the colonies. And these were fijo, or fixed regiments. And the reason they were called fixed is because they were to be fixed to the colony to which they were raised. And these were permanent residents. These weren't going to rotate back to Spain. Obviously, that didn't work for a variety of reasons I go into in the book. And those fixed regiments would augment militia, though the militia was supposed to be capable of offensive action. And in fact, if you look closely at almost every single campaign of the Spanish during the American Revolutionary War, you will find militia. Next. I think you're all familiar with this. I have this mostly for people who aren't as familiar with it. Obviously, here's the local view, St. Louis, Cahokia, St. Genevieve, Kaskaskia. Up here is a layout of St. Louis in 1770. There were 115 houses. About 15 of them were made of stone. There were a few more by 1780. I know that, at least 2 more, because Joseph Rubidoux built 2, a stone house and a vertical log house on what would be later platted as Lot 6. Down below is a map fairly close to the 1780s of Cahokia, and the inset here shows what the mission property is. And the reason I did that is that'll be important later on. That was a large piece of property with a stone rectory and a church and a barn and some of the buildings that went along with it. Next slide. No, I think you skipped one. Oh, maybe not. Go 2 more. There we go. We may have to go back one. All right, so what precipitated the attacks? Why were St. Louis and Cahokia attacked in 1780? Well, there were 4 reasons. One was George Rogers Clark was dispatched from Virginia on a secret mission to conquer the British portion of the Illinois country, and he did that by 1779. Took Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes. There was an attempt to retake Vincennes, but it was ultimately beat off by the famous march by George Rogers Clark. Secondly, there was an enormous amount of contraband that was coming up the Mississippi River from New Orleans, would go all the way over to Fort Pitt, where it could be sent to assist the American colonists, the 13 colonies. Some of it was also diverted to St. Louis for assisting and equipping George Rogers Clark's men. Third, the British traders were prohibited from using the Missouri River, going down there and trapping. There was a rich fur trade and trapping area down there, and the Spanish actually built a small fort in the blockhouse at the beginning of the river, and they restricted the British from going down there, so there was resentment over that. And then finally, and most importantly, is Spain entered the war as an ally of the French in 1779. If you could go back to the slide before. And one of the interesting things in doing the research was that there was a Colonial store at St. Louis where George Rogers Clark could draw down supplies. Numerous, I mean, there were bales of bolts of uniform cloth, mostly blue, some white, and ended up being the main uniform colors. There's a little bit of red and brown, which has given us some speculation about officers' uniforms. But nonetheless, the requisitions show shoes, hats, buttons, you name it, and there was quite a bit of it. One of the problems was that George Rogers Clark's men had to pay in Virginia paper money. And this Virginia paper money didn't have much value. And Fernando de Leyva actually had to personally guarantee. There were other merchants who actually took them and spent years trying to collect on them after the war. Nonetheless, there was quite a equipping of George Rogers Clark's men. I put a quote there at the bottom from one of his officers to George Rogers Clark saying, "A well-clothed soldier is worth 2 naked ones." So, what was the British plan? The Spanish entered the war, and Great Britain, Lord Germain, who was Colonial Secretary to the Americas, developed what I call the Grand Plan. And what the Grand Plan was, he first issued orders to General Campbell down here in Pensacola to gather up soldiers. He also included a large amount of presents to get 2,000 allied Indians to join him, and he was supposed to attack New Orleans and then go further up to Natchez and await the forces that were going to be coming from the north. From the north, Lord Germain issued an order to Frederick Haldimand, who was the governor of Canada. And Haldimand, in turn, then issued a circular letter, it was an order of types, that went to the 2 main sub-forts in the area, Fort Michilimackinac here, and you can look at this, right, Fort Detroit, which should be right over there. And the exact plans, the exact details of how they would attack were left to them. However, the orders were clear that all of these attacks, the intent was to sweep the Americans and the Spanish from the Mississippi Valley, completely take over the whole area. The main attack was to come from Prairie du Chien, where a large number of Indians were gathered, and the reason there were Indians there was there were very few regulars at these forts. They had large Indian departments, and it's fascinating reading, going through all the presents and the things. These Indian departments had smiths, they had officers, interpreters, large amounts of goods went to the Indians, innumerable shirts, scalping knives, you name it. And I've referenced a lot of those in the book. But they were all gathered there. There were about 30 to 40 British traders and their servants. And in charge of the expedition was to be a former British officer named Emmanuel Hess. He was recommissioned he was a trader now, and he was recommissioned as a captain in the Indian Department. There were also 2 major Indian chiefs, Wapasha and Machicuas, and they were both given British red officer coats, complete with gold epaulettes, to show their importance to the expedition. So they were to come down and attacked St. Louis and Cahokia. Along the way, they picked up another 250 Sac and Fox Indians, bringing the total to about 1,000 men. There were to be additional attacks to support the main one. Charles de Longuegaud was to gather the force at St. Joseph, was ferried across to Chicago, was supposed to come down the Illinois River. We'll come back to him in a minute. And then there was a attack by Chief Louis Bled. He was supposed to attack Vincennes. Originally, his orders were to, quote, amuse Clark at the Falls, meaning Louisville, but Clark was nowhere near the falls, so he was redirected towards Vincennes. Then a fairly large expedition under British Captain Henry Byrd was directed to take Louisville, since Clark was no longer there. Most of those were Indians, but there were some British regulars, believe it or not, that were part of that expedition, as well as some Detroit militia. And then finally, about 40 or 50 Huron Indians were dispatched to raid the settlements around Fort Pitt. And the purpose of that was to pin down any reinforcements so they would be deemed necessary by the settlers around there so they wouldn't leave the area. So here's an interesting piece of correspondence in the Newberry Library. It's an undated and unsigned copy of a order by Lieutenant Governor Patrick Sinclair. He was Lieutenant Governor at Michilimackinac, to Longuegaud. And it's interesting, translated by Christine. But the interesting parts are here in yellow. And again, I'm sure in the back you can't read it, but let me try to do my best here. Talks about, he's supposed to, in essence, second the attack. And on your arrival, you shall consult with Captain Hesse, Machacuis, or Wapasha, or any other of His Majesty's officers regarding where you may better serve, whether to stay there 1 month to protect the British garrison on the frontier with Spain, or to aid them in attacking the rebels at Kaskaskia. It will be absolutely necessary that you stay with your detachment on the shore of the Mississippi until the result of the attack against the Spanish post named St. Genevieve is certain. So clearly, not only were Cahokia and St. Louis to be attacked and conquered, but next were to be Kaskaskia and St. Genevieve. And in fact, the orders included Wapasha with his Sutra Indians to then go down further the Mississippi River to meet up with General Campbell. So what was going on in St. Louis? Well, St. Louis had no defenses, nothing. They had, at the time, there were some of them that were spread out. There were 17 soldiers from the 6th Regiment of Louisiana. They had some militia. They actually had just recently created a cavalry company of fine gentlemen. It's interesting to note, and I can't get into all the uniformology here, but Leyva had picked out a red uniform with blue facings for him. It was approved by Bernardo de Galvez. It's kind of interesting because the red coats were exactly like the British. But nonetheless, they expected a cakewalk. There was a mention by Patrick Sinclair in the correspondence that St. Louis was defended by 20 men and 20 brass cannon. They didn't actually make cannons of brass. That's an English term in terms of bronze, but it was meant in a derogatory sense that there wasn't much of a defense there. So the primary defense was determined by Lieutenant Governor Fernando de Leyva to be a stone tower. He actually wanted to build more than one, but there wasn't enough money. He actually had to put up some of his personal funds for the stone work that was there. And the tower was built on a high ground west of the town that could command most of the area. And emanating from the tower were going to be entrenchments, which almost completely surrounded St. Louis. It was 2,000 yards of entrenchments that were built around St. Louis. Cannons, there weren't really, well, I believe there were a couple cannons based on some Spanish correspondence that we found, but there's no definitive proof that there were any cannons existing when the attack was called. But there were 5 cannons up at those forts that were guarding the Missouri River. And Leyva gave instructions to the captain of the militia to go retrieve them. They were brought back and they were hoisted up in the tower. In addition, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, the St. Genevieve militia, which aided in the defense, were ordered specifically to bring all the swivel cannon that they had. As far as men, muskets, and gunpowder, there were 29 regulars when they gathered, including those from the forts along the Missouri River and a few from St. Genevieve. Of the 6th Regiment of Louisiana, there were 281 militia. 54 of those were the cavalry company, and 227 were infantry, but that does include the 60 that were sent from St. Genevieve. It's interesting to note, if you go through and look at some of the soldiers, that some of these were former French soldiers, and many of them were trappers and hunters, which I think was important to the defense. There was no indication that they lacked for gunpowder or muskets at the time. And in addition, food, medical supplies, things like that weren't done in detail, but those were always planned for. The orders to St. Genevieve instructed them to bring food in addition to the swivel guns. And I did note that there were actually 2 surgeons in St. Louis at the time, so they had some capacity to take care of the wounded. Here's just an overview to kind of give you a bearing of St. Louis. This is Ballpark Village. This is the approximate location, 4th and Walnut, where the tower was located. The entrenchments circled the town here, so it just gives you kind of a view of what it looks like with respect to today's architecture. So what did the tower look like? Well, we really don't know. But what we can look at is the towers that were built during this period. Towers started to be built in the 1600s. They were originally called Genoese towers because they were built by the Italians. They kind of morphed into what would later be called a Martello tower. There's books out on Martello towers. But there were a number of towers, and the Spanish built quite a few, and there's images of some of the Spanish towers here under Carlos III. This is a French tower here, and the only reason I put it on there is that it shows you how thick the walls were. And the reason they were so thick was most of these towers were built either on islands or on coastal areas. And they had to withstand the pounding from 36-pounder cannons. And those cannons shot iron balls that were 36 pounds. Now at St. Louis, they didn't have to fear that kind of cannon. They probably had the most be concerned about 6-pounders, maybe 9-pounders. You couldn't really haul cannons that close, so my guess is the walls were probably not that thick. But at least this gives you some idea. Most of these towers were built 30 to 40 feet in height and 30 to 35 feet in width.
Are there any towers like that around here?
No, but again, there's this famous postcard that's floating out there. This is on a lot of websites and actually in some articles about being Fort San Carlos. It's not. This is a daguerreotype. It's a colorized version. It was done in Germany in 1909 of a photo taken by Thomas Easterly in the 1850s. And when he arrived in St. Louis, this was the only stone tower that remained, and it was nicknamed the Spanish Fort. And because it had this roof on it, it got confused with Fort San Carlos, and I'll get into that in a minute. But you can see it's right on the river. Fort San Carlos was built up on the hill. If you do the dimensions, there's 2 young boys here. It's unlikely it was the tower. And if you do the research, you'll actually find that this is Anton Roy's Windmill. And it was approved by the Spanish in 1797, and it was deemed not to be a threat to the town. It was built near Billet Street. There's some more pictures from the Missouri History Museum of the same structure, taken by Thomas Easterly. So here's an interesting map by Louis Beck in 1822 that he published in Beck's Gazetteer. And it shows you a number of things. First of all, here is Anton Roy's Windmill. You can see it here. The Fort San Carlos Tower has a roof on it. So here's where we start to get into some of the confusion. Why does it have a roof? Because by this time, it's no longer used as a defensive structure. It was converted to a prison and a storage area, and the roof was put on to keep the rain out. There were some additional towers that were built. These are kind of crude drawings, but maybe they might give you an idea of how the towers looked, and those were in existence when this map was done. Some of you may know there's another structure called the Spanish Fort out in Defiance. The reason I put it on here along with the picture of Roy's Windmill is these are really the only two images we have of stonework that was done, defensive stonework. I have my doubts about the function of this. I think it was mostly to protect horses. It wasn't a true fort in the sense of the word. And I've walked around it and looked at the windows extensively. But I think this does give you some clues as to maybe how the Spanish used stonework in this period. So the St. Louis and Cahokia were lucky enough to have 6 weeks advance notice of the attacks, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because this area wasn't very well populated, but nonetheless, news traveled fast. And they had actually had some earlier reports which they dismissed, but then a reliable trader came down and then they knew it was for real. There's actually a record in the archives about the blessing of the first stone of the Fort San Carlos Tower. So it's a recorded event, happened on April 17, 1780, in the presence of several militia officers and other important individuals. Here's an artist's depiction of the tower for the book. The tower was not fully complete at the time of the attack. The upper level, the wall that was supposed to be there in front of the cannons, was not complete. They actually used some woodwork in there to complete it at the time of the attack. They were able to haul the 5 cannon up there. They were all in place, though I'm sure they were pointed in different directions. But unlike field cannon, which are meant to be hauled around the field, the type of cannons that they used here in Arkansas Post and other places were fortress-type cannons. And these had small wheels. They were very boxy and very sturdy. This wedge here was the way they actually aimed the cannon. They would pull it or push it in, and it would actually change the elevation. But these were the type of cannon that were used at these battles. Reinforcements from St. Genevieve. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that St. Genevieve was requested. There were letters sent to both Captain Francois Valet, the old man Valet, and to Lieutenant Silvio Cortabana of the Spanish Fixed Regiment to send reinforcements to St. Louis, and they were sent by boat. They were supposed to include food and the swivel guns I talked about before. Now, Francois Valet, old man Valet, was too old, so he sent his sons, both of whom were lieutenants in the St. Genevieve militia. One was a first lieutenant, one was a second lieutenant or ensign. And at the bottom there, you'll see Robbie Pratt over at the Bolduc house was kind enough to let me photograph Francois Valet II's sword. This is a typical French hunting sword that was made, and there were innumerable amounts of them made in the late 18th century. This one actually had an inscription on it. Christine was able to decipher it. It indicates that this sword was made by a merchant named Milot on Convent Street in Dijon, France. I actually have my own, I have another hunting sword from this period in my own collection. And some of them were even actually used to equip militia. There's a Virginia militia unit that was completely equipped with these swords. This was mentioned before. This is the St. Genevieve, Louisiana Infantry Militia Company roster from 1779. Had 175 officers and men. You can see at the top here, Francois Valet, Captain, Charles Valet, First Lieutenant, Francois Valet, reference him as 2, as Second Lieutenant, and Jean-Baptiste Valet as Cadet. I don't have time to go into cadets, but it's something that I've been researching a lot lately, the cadets in Louisiana. But suffice it to say, it wasn't just a boy in the militia. These were actually holding positions that would eventually move on to a lieutenant's position once a vacancy was there. But some of these cadets could get into their late 20s before a vacancy was open. As you can see, it was signed by Francois Valet and Fernando de Leyva. Here's a map we made for the book showing the attack. The attack came out of the north. Actually, the day before, the British had sent out scouts to reconnoiter St. Louis and Cahokia, and they couldn't get close enough because the residents were out working the farms. So they weren't able to see the defenses. So as they burst in through the north by the Indian mounds, they aren't there anymore, they were removed in the 1860s, but when they came down from the north, they sent another detachment to the south because they expected the St. Louis inhabitants to flee for the safety down the St. Genevieve Road. And by the way, there was a road that went down to St. Genevieve. Fernando de Leyva built it. It was referred to later, a few years later, as a trail, so I don't know how much of a road it was, but it was meant so that the cavalry militia company could reinforce St. Genevieve in the wintertime. The Indians attacked, and the attack went on for 2 hours. We don't know all the details of it. We know that they probed to try to find a way into the village, were unsuccessful. They did find a weak spot here on top of the area where they were able to fire down on the militia that were behind the entrenchments, causing a momentary panic. But almost at the same time, the Sac and Fox Indians, who had been reluctant allies to begin with, began to pull back. And at that, the other Indians and British traders thought there was treachery, and they retreated as well. So the attack at that point, after 2 hours, finished. There were about 750 men that took part in this attack. And the attack did come without prior warning. It was a surprise. A number of the people that were captured and killed were captured out in the fields by the Indians. And there's a lot of anecdotal history that goes along with the battle. I'm only going to touch on a couple stories here because we did research some of them to see how much fact there was. First involves Madame Regouche. And Madame Regouche was, as the story goes, when the attack alarm came, she donned her husband's militia coat, she grabbed a knife, she grabbed a pistol, and ran to the main gate to urge the men on. That's the story. Well, she actually existed, and she was married to Ignace, and Ignace, or Ignacio, as they translated these back and forth, was in the St. Louis militia, and actually found her house. And they lived in 2 blocks away from the main gate, so the story seems fairly plausible. She also went on to found the first girls' school in St. Louis. The second story that I focused on was what I call the mad dash to the gate. A gentleman named Louis Chancelier, my French is a little rusty, so bear with me, Madame Baguette, which could very well be Biguette or Biguerre, and her 2 daughters and an American named Kennedy were all caught together out in the fields when the attack came. They all piled into a carreta, or a Spanish cart, that was led by 2 horses. Every one of them was shot. The horses were shot multiple times, but they managed to make it into the gate, and as they made it into the gate, the 2 horses fell dead, but they had made it to safety. Now that's the story, obviously probably romanticized some. But Chancelier, Baguette, and 2 daughters, they're all listed as wounded in the official militia list. Now we couldn't find the Kennedy. Don't know whether he was there or not. As the story goes, Chancelier screamed at the Indians, "You'll not get my American." I don't know whether that's true or not. But there is an entry in the listings that translates to another who was there, obviously an unnamed person. So it's certainly possible that that could be the American Kennedy. Here's a panoramic painting we had done for the book of the battle, just to kind of give a feel for the extent of the battle. It was a very large area that was fought over. There's the tower there, obviously the river, the northern lines, and you can see groups of Indians attacking this point. Here is the official casualty list from the battle. It was signed by Fernando de Leyva. After the battle, he lists 21 dead. I mentioned 22 there because one of the captured individuals, Cardinal, was killed while he tried to escape that day. There were 7 wounded and 25 prisoners on his list. However, there were a whole lot of other people that were along the Mississippi River doing their normal business that were captured at the time, and there were 46 of those. The British, in turn, at St. Louis, claimed only 4 dead and 4 wounded, all Winnebago Indians. I find that very hard to believe. Now granted, muskets weren't all that accurate back then, but for 2 hours, and all Winnebagos, I doubt it. There was an attempt to get the Sioux to attack the next year, and my guess is that this was for political reasons. Here's a piece I had done for this conference. It shows the Valet brothers at the Battle of St. Louis defending the entrenchments. You can see in the background, the tower there, the church. We tried to put in a number of the examples, but we thought it was fitting to do. Next slide. After the battle, both Charles Valet and Francois Valet II were recognized by Governor Bernardo de Galvez for their bravery. Francois Valet, old man Valet, was made a special lieutenant in the Spanish Army and recognized as a Don. It was a particularly important recognition, carrying with it many privileges. The Spanish in command, Fernando de Leyva and Silvio Francisco de Cartabona, were also recognized. They were given promotions. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Governor Fernando de Leyva, by the time he got his, he had died and did not receive it, so it was given to him in death. So what was going on at Cahokia? Well, Cahokia had the same problem. They didn't have any defenses either. There was an old fort in the center of town that was totally dilapidated. There was a small stone building in the center. But what they did have was the mission property, and that was a property that the British, who had been there for a short period of time after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, had used as a barracks. So that was christened Fort Bowman, and that was to be used as the center of the defense, and it was a stone building. Actually, when I dug through all the requisition records, I found gunpowder recognitions for 1 field piece, so they did have at least 1 cannon there. Men, muskets, and gunpowder. The gunpowder requisitions are extremely interesting. They're very detailed. They go by officer to officer. There's even a requisition of gunpowder and musket balls for a friendly detachment of Indians. The total amount of men is not specified. My best guess is that there were about 150. That would include both American regulars under George Rogers Clark and French colonial militia. And again, food, medical supplies. I don't have as much detail, but we did find an interesting entry. There was a requisition for a very large amount of meat for Clark and his officers a few days before the battle. The romantic history says Clark arrived the day of the battle. The requisitions seem to indicate maybe he was there a day or 2 before. And here was a painting we did of the attack. The Rigolet stream is here. There's a small bridge across it. The Indians surged across the Rigolet stream. Here is the stone building. Here is the church at the time, the typical French fence that was there. And this attack, like at St. Louis, lasted around 2 hours. There were 250 Indians. They were led by Ducharme, who was a British trader, and Chief Machicuas of the Chippewa Indians. I'll have a map in a minute. Pretty much the battle unfolded the same way. They looked for an opening. They tried some feints to draw some of the troops out, and they were unsuccessful. Here's a map. You can see St. Louis up here. Here is the mission property, which was the focal point, or excuse me, over here, the focal point of the defense. The Indians came across the Rigolet stream, attacking from various quarters, were unable to find any openings, and as Sinclair noted, they tried various feints, but were unable to draw the Americans out of the stone house. Here is the mission property today. This was a picture I took when I was escorted around by John Reed over at the Holy Family Catholic Church. This is looking from where the Rigolet stream was. It's no longer there anymore. At the time, though, you could get a flatboat of it. And here is the present day church that was built a few years later right over the location of the stone barracks. I went back many times walking around myself trying to visualize how the battle happened. But as I mentioned, I wasn't always by myself. There was an incredible number of chiggers that accompanied me all over the place. But I was able to get, I think, a fairly good feel of how the battle unfolded. So after the attacks were beaten off, that wasn't the end of the war in the West by a long shot. Of course, I'm only going to be able to touch about things in Arkansas Post and some other areas, but with respect to the northern part, there was a pursuit force that was put together of Americans and Spanish, and it was almost entirely Spanish militia and American regulars. Some of them were mounted, and they pursued the British attackers. And the British split up into two groups. One of them went up the Illinois River, and they ran smack into Charles de Longlade, who had been delayed by some friendly Indians, and he joined the retreat. The Americans and Spanish that were mounted chased them, but arrived a few days late. There was actually a British ship, the Felicity, and another private vessel that picked them up and took them back to Fort Michilimackinac. The other group retreated up the Mississippi River. They were unable to catch them, but what they did do is they stopped at the main Sac and Fox village of Sackinock, and they burnt it to the ground. They also tied a note to the tree saying they would be back next year. I find it kind of reluctant or kind of interesting that they burnt the town of the Indians that might have won the battle for them by retreating, but it was the closest Indian village, and by virtue of its proximity probably suffered the fate that it did. There was also an attempt to make it to Prairie du Chien. Why? Well, the British traders had left all their furs there. There were 360 bales of furs that were in a blockhouse, but the British were able to rescue them, at least 300 of them. They burnt the other 60. So by the time the Spanish and Americans got there, there was no booty to be had. Getting close, so I'm going to have to kind of go through this quickly, go through a lot of other attacks and battles in the book. I just wanted to mention a few. 1781, there was a Spanish expedition that was sent against British Fort St. Joseph near Lake Michigan. And that was dispatched by Lieutenant Governor Cruzat. Fernando Vallejo, of course, had died and been replaced by Cruzat. That force consisted almost entirely of Spanish infantry militia. It was led by Captain Eugenio Poirier, aided by a large number of Indians. Interestingly, the Spanish flag was planted in front of the fort and left there for 24 hours. I've poured through the records. We don't know exactly why they did that. I saw no instructions to do that. That event, that planting of the flag, though, for that period of time was an act of sovereignty. And this issue came up later when they got to the peace table, because although the Spanish were helping us a lot, by the time the peace came around, they were not necessarily our friends. They didn't want the Americans having any territory beyond the 13 colonies, and they certainly didn't want them to have any rights to navigate the Mississippi River, despite the fact that George Rogers Clark had already captured part of the property and they bordered the Mississippi River. There was also, interesting, a lot of people talk about the Battle of St. Louis being the only battle west of the Mississippi River. It wasn't. There was an attack on Arkansas Post in 1783 by James Colbert and some Chickasaw Indians. They actually captured a number of the inhabitants and some of the soldiers. He reportedly threw his tomahawk into the dirt saying, "I will return," but the war did end, and he met his fate being thrown from a horse, and so he was never able to return. There was a small fort that was defended by soldiers of the 6th Regiment of Louisiana. Lastly, although I don't have much time to go into uniformology, there's quite a bit of it in the book. Up to the right are a couple of photographs of some paintings that are in the Louisiana State Museum. Louisiana militia officers. There's a lieutenant on the left and a captain on the right. You can tell by the epaulettes. To the left is our drawing of a likely campaign dress for the militia. The Spanish records over in Spain indicate that they wore blue with red. But like most frontier areas, and particularly since a lot of these men were hunters and voyagers, the like, my guess is they dispensed with a lot of the typical regulation dress. These leggings and moccasins and things were essential for going out on expeditions in the undeveloped area. We did find some interesting correspondence from Alejandro O'Reilly criticizing officers and soldiers for not wearing the standard militia uniform, but nonetheless, I find it hard to believe that they A, all had uniforms, and B, that they were all regulation. That's it. I don't know if I have time for a question or not. We're at 2 minutes away from the time I'm supposed to start. I'm happy, by the way, to stay and answer any questions that you have. Yes.
I think it was the picture of the captain on the right. Was that Pedro Rousseau?
Yes.
What was that?
Yes.
So that was a militia uniform and not his.
That was,
military.
he was cited as being in the militia at the time that painting was supposedly done.
But he was also an army officer.
He's mentioned as an army officer, but he's also mentioned as being in the militia.
Yeah, right. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know for sure.
He
You know,
was even
exactly.
the captain of a war galley.
Yes, right, right. There were several other paintings. Some of them, particular museums wanted an exorbitant amount of money to reproduce them that also show the same coloring, but that is the coloring that we use. Yes, sir.
Question, with a question about the tower. I don't quite understand the military significance of the tower as it would be part of a comprehensive defensive plan. What would be its purpose? I mean, it has the cannon, obviously, but those don't have a tremendous range to begin with.
Well, the range, I actually go through this in the book, and there's actually a mention in the official correspondence about the range, and that the range was not quite sufficient to cover the entire perimeter, meaning that it could cover a lot of it. There's also a great local history where the Indians supposedly called the tower the House of Thunder. And the reason they did that is they were totally surprised. They were not expecting cannon. When the cannon started booming from the tower, it gave them a lot of pause. I agree with you that I suspect that those cannonballs caused very few casualties. But I think the psychological effect of those cannons was enormous, especially for Indians who had been promised pretty much a walk in the park, and all of a sudden they're met with entrenchments, with musket fire, with swivel guns, and this cannon that's booming relentlessly at them. Anyone else? Thank you.